Well, this afternoon I'm going to concentrate a little more on some of the things we're doing on our operation as far as integrating the livestock. And I start out with this. I actually own this newspaper from 1871. It's the Prairie Farmer. I was in you know, when you spend as much time in airports as I do, you tend to go through a lot of books. So I was in this bookstore in Ohio, and they had this newspaper laying there. So I bought it because it reminded me on the, you know, on the northern plains where I'm at, how were our prairie soils formed? Well, they were formed by large herds of bison and other animals moving across them, being forced to move by the wolves. You know, and you think back of how the soils were formed, you know, and I don't care where you were in this country, there was animals on them, you know, whether it was the bison or elk or deer and coyotes, wolves, you know, and then there was the species that remained on the land all the time, like rabbits. And the number one, as far as numbered herbivore on the Great Plains, was that of the grasshopper. And that goes to show just the diversity that was there. I can drive for hundreds of miles now without seeing a fence. Where are the animals? You know, and realize that this was a long, slow process for me. I'm a slow learner. I got to learn everything the hard way. But when I start thinking back of a natural ecosystem and how it functioned, all of these things play a role. So where are the animals in production agriculture today? Are they out on the land? You know, Sir Albert Howard, who many of you have heard, said this many years ago. Above all, never does nature separate the animal and vegetable worlds. This is a mistake that she cannot endure, and of all the errors which modern agriculture has committed, this abandonment of mixed husbandry has been the most fatal. And he said this 50 years ago. And have we gotten any better? No. This is just an overview of my operation, some of the land. I don't know if I have a pointer on this. This on the very south end, that's Interstate 94, the main highway going through North Dakota. And then that's my main farmstead. Up here, about 4.5 miles away, that's my son lives there. And what I'm depicting here is we have some other land that's not close enough to be in this picture, but the light blue areas are cropland. So that's some of the 2,000 acres of cropland we have. The dark green areas, that's tame grass pastures. In other words, that was farmed at one time. This up here was all in CRP, and I bought this part here, and then this here. I went to that landowner, and it was in CRP. They could have re-enrolled it, and I told her, I said, I'll make a deal with you. I will give you the same amount of money you can get as if you enrolled it in CRP if you let me put it into a grazing system. Now, there was no fences, no water. I had to develop all that. But I said, I want a 10-year lease. And she gave that to me. So I'm paying, for North Dakota terms, fairly high rates for that. But I've got the water on my land, and then I piped it through hers. All of the yellow boundaried areas are true native pastures. So they've never been touched. Now, what you can't see from this aerial photo is, right here, there's 180 houses going in. There's 40-acre, I call them squatters, but they're ranchettes all between here and that place. And so we have a lot of development going on. So it adds some difficulty to the way we manage. But how do we integrate these? And that's what I'm going to focus on. I mentioned this earlier, and I'm not going to talk a lot about the native rangeland. I'll just say this much about it. Those 2,000 acres we have, when we purchased the operation, there was 3 pastures on that farm, and it was pretty much season-long grazing. We now have over 100 permanent pastures, and we have an infinite number of smaller pastures. We used to be in a twice-over system, you know, and we found that we could not get full recovery on the rangeland by coming back to it a second time that year with our limited moisture. So we now are in a once-over system on our native rangeland and the majority of our tame grass pastures. The majority of our pastures are grazed certainly less than 3 days the entire year, and most of them have livestock on them 1 day the entire year. So that's how much we're rotating. Rest, recovery. That's what it's about. Now the tame grass pastures, maybe I should go back to it. These tame grass pastures here, how this started, when I bought the place in '91, that was all cropland. And I went to NRCS and asked them, you know, I want to seed some of this into tame grasses. Well, they recommended to me smooth brome, intermediate, and pubescent wheatgrass. So I seeded it all, got a beautiful catch. But remember from my presentation this morning, we could only infiltrate 1/2 inch of rainfall per hour. It had been tilled and summer fallow for many years, you know, very little crop diversity. We had no nutrient cycling. I got no production off it. So what I did, I actually put in a shallow pipeline myself. I went out there and I seeded into that 200 acres of brome, intermediate, and pubescent. I seeded about 15 different species of legumes into those paddocks individually. I used bird's foot trefoil. I used Falcata alfalfa that Kim talked about. I used Sicer milk vetch, different clovers, because I couldn't find any good research data on which ones would work in my soils. So I tried it myself. Now, since then, I've learned, you know, which species work best in my environment, and now we seed combinations. And now, through high stock density grazing, rest recovery, we've got decent production where we used to not have very good production at all. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the tame grass native pastures. What I'm going to talk about is integrating that livestock onto the cropland. As I mentioned this morning, you need to find your production gap. And by production gap, I either mean a gap in time where you can grow a cover crop or a nutritional quality gap. One of the things as a producer I needed to do right away was figure out the forage nutrition that I had available. So when on our ranch is, for instance, the cool season native actively growing and at its nutrient peak? Well, on our operation, it's from late May into early July. The warm seasons come on from early July into early August. Smooth brome grass, I don't like that grass, but we have a lot of it because we rented that expired CRP. Expired CRP land in North Dakota is 90% smooth brome, 10% noxious weeds. That's what it is. So you got to learn to make use of it. But that's real early in the year. Kentucky bluegrass, invasive species, also really early. Then the alfalfa a little later. Then I started figuring out when can I grow these different cover crops and fit them into our nutritional, to meet the nutritional needs of the livestock. For instance, winter triticale, hairy vetch, oats and peas, the brown mid-sorghum Sudan mixes, grazing corn, a lot longer window, and then the brassicas, hairy vetch, things like that, we can graze into December. But see, if I was to just rely on the natives, I got a very short time of the year that those are at their nutritional peak. Let's use those cover crops to fill in and balance those nutrient needs of our livestock for the remaining part of the year. So we charted that out. As I mentioned this morning, these fall-seeded biennials are one of the easiest ways to integrate cover crops into your operation. I started growing this winter triticale hairy vetch back in 1995, and it's been a slam dunk no-brainer for me. I mean, it just works on our soils. It may or may not work for you. This is the winter wheat, winter pea, hairy vetch radish that I talked to you about this morning, and we can get decent bricks. Readings on that, we can get really good gains on that in our environment. The beauty of this is it gives us a lot of options, these winter biennials. We can hay them. Now, we only take hay off of our own land in the case of emergencies. For instance, one of those was in 2006. I showed you that series of slides this morning on the radish and the turnip that dried up, and then the cover crop that multi-species that thrive. That plot is only a mile south of this field. And this picture was taken in 2006. I'll tell you the story. We had went and seeded this winter triticale hairy vetch in September. It laid for 3 weeks. It was too dry to even germinate. We got a 1/2 inch of rain on it about the 1st of October, and it germinated. We were open that winter, not a lot of snow. The next spring, we had 1.4 inches of rain on this before I hayed it. So that's 1.9 inches of rain plus some snow, but not a lot of snow. And we got that type of production in a drought year. And I got to tell you a true story about this. The interstate is right on the south side of those hay bales, the bottom of the picture here. Phone rang the day before I took this picture, the phone rang. And guy on the other line asked, "Is that your hay bales in that field, north side of the interstate?" And I thought he was going to ask me what it was and how I got that much production. And he says, "You need to get them bales off that field, because if you don't, we're not going to get disaster assistance." That was his attitude. That's a true story. And I said, "You know what? If you would have had hay winter biennials seeded, you wouldn't need disaster assistance." And I hung up the phone on him. And I did, and that's the reason I went and took this picture then the day afterwards, because I thought that's the mentality that some producers have. This is my drought insurance. I build it into my system. Cover crops are a way to do that. Am I always going to hay these? No, I prefer not to hay them. We prefer to graze them. As I showed you this morning, we like calving on this. For one thing, it allows us rest and recovery of our tame grass pastures, because we get the cattle out on this at an early time. Now, as I mentioned, we calve from mid-May through the end of June. And you can see there's not a lot of corrals around there. I mean, they're either going to calve on their own or they won't. You know, they'll take care of it themselves. And we can also graze stocker cattle on there. Works really well. They'll put on good gains. Now, we do not grow these cover crops on the same acres every year. You know, we rotate them around to the different 2,000 acres of cropland. The calves are extremely healthy. I mean, we don't wean our calves until sometime in March here. Our calves are still out on the cows all winter. They're out there, and I'll show you some pictures coming up here. When we wean these calves, needless to say, the cows are a bit thin. But they have, come April here, this stuff will start greening up. Along with the Kentucky bluegrass, we can get them out there. Those cows will put on 4 or 5 pounds a day gain. And by the time they calve mid-May, they're in good shape. The calves are really healthy. Now, I got to tell a little story before the next slide comes up. My son, he's 27 now, but he was in college for 4 years and you know, got a lot of friends there, and a lot of them are in the old production style model. I'll call it old, but the one we used to use. And they're calving in the winter, and they called them up here a few years ago. We had some really bad winters, 2 in a row, where we had 120 plus inches of snow, and they called them up and said they were really cussing the weather out and saying how rough it was, you know, getting calves into the house because they had frozen ears and scours and fighting mud and slop and etc. And Paul says, "Well, I feel for you, but you can feel sorry for me too when I calve." So he sent them this picture. And that really is how much we enjoy calving on our operation. When we made the switch, I told my wife, I feel guilty. I should have to pay somebody to allow me to enjoy life this much. It just is no work. There's just no work to us calving anymore. But anyway, these fall biennials really put out high nutrient density, and we can get really good gains on them on stocker cattle also. Now, so that's one option I have. What I'm trying to do is build a case for you of all these different options you can use these cover crops for, especially if you have livestock. Remember I talked to you this morning about having to identify your resource concern. Okay, and one of those 5 keys of building healthy soil is armor on the soil surface. Now, one of the things we do if we want armor or protection, say we have a field, we had planted a low residue crop the year before, we needed to add some armor, we can purposely let these fall biennials get more mature, in other words, to a higher carbon state. And then we'll run high stock density of livestock on them. Now, obviously, if you want maximum gain, I'll go back here. If you want maximum gain, you're not going to be grazing livestock when you see a seed head on there. And also, if you're grass finishing, you can't run your cattle on any grain that seed head's developing. So this is being ran with a group of cattle that we'll go to the conventional market with. But we'll let it get more mature, and then we'll go in there and we'll use these bat latches. Many of you have seen them. Those are solar-powered gate openers. That's a bungee cord gate attached to it. You just go out there and you set the time you want that little dial to turn, and then that gate will fly open. And we set up various number of paddocks. Usually when we're addressing a resource concern such as this, adding armor to the soil surface, we will run high stock densities of about anywhere from 650,000 pounds animal equivalent per acre up to 1 million pounds per acre. So there's 330 some head in that mob. You can see that's not very big paddocks they're on. And it'll take us about an hour, hour and a half in the morning to roll up the previous day's fences, set up the new ones, set up the bat latches, and then the cattle move themselves the rest of the day. Here that bat latch just flew open and they're moving on to the next break. They're only on there for a matter of hours. We're also taking bricks readings. Now, you're going to have higher bricks content in the afternoon because that's when the plant's collecting the most sunlight, most photosynthesis is taking place. So we'll move our cattle once during the morning, then multiple moves in the afternoon, so as the energy content of that forage is the highest, they're eating the most, going to put on the most weight then too. This is what it looks like after they go through. Now that's carbon on the soil surface, and a lot of producers would say, boy, but that's waste. No, that isn't waste, that's nutrient cycling, and that's armor. So we start with this. There's what a close-up looks like. Look at that ground cover we got there. That's what I want to see. The dung and urine are distributed, and we have real uniform armor or protection on that soil surface. Here is the economic data then. That particular group right here, this was 187 yearlings. We ran them 58 days on that field. Gross profit there, we used 80 cents per head per day because that's what we can get custom grazing. And then we take out of there our seed cost, seeding cost, half of the land cost because I'm going to get another crop on there yet. And we come out with a net profit of $185 per acre. That's not very high. We can do a lot better. But what's the real value of enhanced soil health? You know, that armor means a lot to us. And we're not done with this particular piece of ground for this year. Then we come in with a very diverse mix, the same picture I showed you this morning, and we're going to use it as a biological primer. And I think of, instead of the term cover crop, I like biological primer, because what we're really trying to do is use a cover crop to enhance the life and the function of the soil. We're trying to feed all that soil biology. We're trying to maximize sunlight collection. Put armor on the soil surface. This is the diversity of that particular cover crop mix. Again, we're going in there at the warm time of the year, so we're going to mostly put warm season crops. Sorghum, sudan, millet, soybean, cowpea, sunflower, those can all handle our summer heat. And I know we don't get as hot as you guys, but we can still get fairly hot. Also hybrid pearl millet's a warm season, then we add some legumes in there as well, and a few brassicas. We also put crops in there. Notice like there's safflower. Very many of you familiar with safflower? Safflower, it's an oilseed crop. It looks like a thistle, big spines on it. Cattle will not eat it. Why would I want that in my cover crop mix? For exactly that reason. Cattle won't eat it. I mentioned to you earlier, 6 inches, a good part of our moisture is from snow. I need to leave some residue out there upright, standing structure to catch snow. Also, safflower has a beautiful flower on it, attracts a lot of pollinators and insects on it. Buckwheat's in that mix. Cattle, they eat buckwheat a little bit, but the main reason buckwheat's in there, it's a phosphorus scavenger. Its root exudates will help break down that organic phosphorus, help convert it to inorganic. So all these different species in here play a role. It's not like we're just throwing things together. So often in the cover crop seed business, I have people, they just, whatever I got left, I'll plant. It's a good recipe for disaster. You got to think things through because it's that diversity that drives soil health. Here we are then from this photo right there to the next photo here when I'm seeding it. That's only about 4 days apart. When you're at that high of a carbon and that triticale plant is that far along, after those cattle move through, it'll just die. So that's my crop roller, more or less. I'm using the livestock to terminate that crop. And then we seed right into that. 4 days later, we can get those cowpeas and radish already start poking through there. They're extremely quick to germinate most years with that residue on the surface like that. People ask, how do those small seeds get up? Look at that photo. That shows it pretty well. The large seeds just break away for those small seeds to come up. It's just nature's way. Notice the aggregation, those of you who are sitting close enough, on that soil. That's how you want your soil to look. Soil should look like cottage cheese. The other thing is, even though the soil temps warm, look at the earthworms up near the surface. They don't shut down when you have that armor on the soil surface. So we were able to achieve our resource concern on this field by putting armor on the soil surface and using livestock. We're also maximizing solar energy collection. When you grow a monoculture in a field, how many different leaf sizes and shapes do you have? Collecting sunlight. One. Look at the difference we have in these polycultures. No matter the angle of the sun, we're going to have different heights. We're going to have different leaf sizes, shapes. We're going to maximize solar energy collection. And that's all of us are as producers. We're trying to maximize the use of photosynthesis. The other thing you can do in these covers is you can use them to your advantage. Plantain is a natural internal parasite control. We haven't used any anthelminthix, dewormers, porons, anything on our cattle in over 8 years. And this is the reason. The cattle will search out these species that'll help them deworm themselves. This is Boston plantain, works really well for us. So we throw it into some of these mixes and take advantage of this. It's an herb and it reseeds itself. Now, we let that cover crop grow that warm season. Warm season covers are C4 grasses. C4 grasses are going to have extra carbon molecule. They're going to have more energy. So then we can put on maximum gain. This is, like I showed this morning, a group of animals we're grass finishing. We do not run near as high a stock density when we're grass finishing because we're trying now for maximum gain. Before we were trying to put armor on the soil surface. Here we're trying for maximum gain on the livestock. We'll run typically 150,000 to 250,000 pounds animal live weight per acre. It's not that high a stock density, and we'll let them select for what they want. So here's the economics of that. That group, we had 134 steers. They averaged 2.6 pounds a day. We ended up netting $147 an acre from that trip across that cropland. Then you add those two together. So in other words, we netted $332 an acre off those two grazing passes. That's pretty decent. We can definitely keep a farm going on that. Is it as much money as we can make planting corn? No, but our corn wouldn't be near as good if we didn't have this as part of our rotation. Now I want to stop here and just say for a minute, we have 2,000 acres of cropland. Only about 10% of it each year are in these grazing mixes for the full season. The rest of the other 1,800 acres is still cash crops. I don't want to give any of you the impression that that's all we're doing is growing covers and grazing and once in a while a cash crop. No, the majority of our income off cropland is from cash crops, but this is an important part of improving soil health on the cropland. And it's about feeding the whole too. I mentioned the safflower, the buckwheat, flowering species. We now have people who raise bees come to us and they pay us to allow them to have their bees on our land in order that they can take advantage of all those flowering species. There's Phacelia. Phacelia is a species. It's used a lot in Europe, and it does not provide good grazing for the livestock, but it really is a native pollinator attractant. I mean, we seed it a little later in the year, and it really attracts the native pollinators, and we've noticed a real jump in insects by adding it. It also has a tremendous fibrous taproot, so we're putting a lot of organic material into the ground. About 2/3 of your organic matter increase will come from roots, so we got to focus on growing species with maximum roots also, because that's how we feed soil biology. Now, we can let this grow then. If we don't want to graze it with grass-finished animals or stock or cattle, for those of you not grass-finishing, we can let it go and get more mature. For those of you who were up to my place in August and you saw that cover crop that we only had 38/100ths an inch of rain on, that is this field. Started raining in early September and it took off and kept growing. And then that's the picture right after a killing frost. Now I used to think that our last killing frost in the spring was usually between 10th, 15th of May. Our first one in the fall between 10th, 15th of September. I used to think that 120 days was my growing season. It's not that way anymore. These brassicas will easily grow until the temperature has to drop to about 12 to 15 degrees for 3 nights in a row. We can have living plants most years on our operation up until Thanksgiving. And that's pretty good for North Dakota. We added another 60 days, on the backside of our growing season. You might as well take advantage of being able to collect sunlight and build soil health, grow feed for the livestock, etc., etc. Again, this is how we convert them to dollars, is with livestock. We use portable fences in the winter just like we do in the summer. Now, we don't move them 5 or 6 times a day in the winter. We're moving them once a week, once every 2 weeks, whenever we're not ice fishing or whenever I'm not out speaking or whatever. That's when we'll move them, But the key fact is we do move them because we don't want them to graze too much. We want to leave that residue. Now, obviously, the ground's froze up there. As long as we get snow, then it's fine. We just push the pigtail posts into the snow. If the ground's froze, no snow, then we just use a cordless drill with a cement bit on it, drill a little pilot hole, away we go. One thing you will get with cover crops is a lot of wildlife. And we get a lot of wildlife. I mentioned earlier that we had 2 winters in a row of 120 plus inches of snow. The deer just congregated. They came from miles. Game and fish flew that home section of mine. On the 1/4 of land that was cropland, on that home section, they counted 876 deer one winter. That's a lot of deer. That cost me some money in feed. But you can't blame the deer. They said they had deer they collared 55 miles away that migrated to our place because of the cover crops. But you need to spin it to your advantage. If you want to make money off that, you just start charging people to come and hunt. Let them on your land. It's all income streams. You're only limited by your imagination. But because of the deer, sometimes then if we have a lot of pressure, we got to use cable instead of polywire. So that's, steel cable we're using for fence during the winter if we're under a lot of deer pressure. And the deer can get trained just like the livestock. Now, what are these forages worth nutritionally during the winter? There was a good study done by North Dakota State where they took and they tested these forages in September before a frost, and then they tested them again in December. So this is the data they got in December. Those radishes were still 14% crude protein, 70% TDN. Really high in nutrition. Hairy vetch, as I told you, I really like that crop. Hairy vetch during the growing season will test 25 to 30% crude protein. In December, it'll still test 18% crude protein. You can milk cows on that stuff in December. It really works. So these calves here, they're still nursing on their mothers in December, but they're balancing their protein needs with that hairy vetch. Then if they want the fiber, they graze on that brown midrib sorghum Sudan. Millet, our millets tend to not test that high in crude protein. They're more like 5% and really low in TDN. If we're going to use cover crops that we want to graze during the winter, we don't put a lot of millet into the mixes. We prefer to put the brown midrib sorghum Sudan. It'll hold its value longer, as will grazing corn or something like that. Allow your livestock to do what they do best. Too many people think they need to provide a bed and breakfast to their livestock. Our livestock are there to make us money. If they can't handle it, McDonald's will gladly take them. It's just, people think it's cruel to do this. I've got pictures of where we turn cattle onto bale grazing, and I'm assuming you're all familiar with bale grazing. When our snow gets too deep and we get into late February and March, we'll move to some bale grazing out on tame grass pastures. I turned some cattle out there about 3 weeks ago, and they ignored the bales and went to grazing. Cattle would rather graze than be fed if you allow them to. Now, how cold will they put up with? That's not muskox. That's our cow-calf pairs, 40 degrees below zero. They're out grazing cover crops. Nearest tree is a half mile away. They can walk back to that tree, or trees. There's not very many. We allow our cattle in the winter the opportunity to walk back to a farmstead for shelter if they so choose. They can also walk back for water if they so choose. Those old cows know if a storm's coming, they can sense it, they'll start going back. Other than that, 40 degrees still below still wasn't cold enough. They didn't go back that day. Evidently they wanted to eat, you know. So cattle can survive if you allow them to. This is that test then at tasseling on that corn. You know, it's all about nutrient cycling. It's all about feeding biology. I'm going to show you the difference now with this bar graph here, the difference livestock, no livestock. And I should tell you, the 2,000 acres of cropland we have, there's 400 acres I don't graze livestock on. It's in the middle of housing developments. There's no worse call than getting a call that the cow's drinking out of the neighbor's swimming pool. So you don't want that. And that's the only water we got is the neighbor's swimming pool, so we can't put cattle on those 400 acres. I still grow cover crops on those 400 acres every year. We just have to charge off the cost of growing those cover crops to the next year, following year's cash crops, you know, because we don't have the livestock to convert them to dollars. We're still going to grow cover crops, but the soil health there will never be to the point it is where we're able to graze livestock. For all of you cash grain guys only, pay attention here. The red bar here is from a field that I was there in May of 1983 when it was seeded to alfalfa. When I took over the farm in 91, it was still in alfalfa. When I started no-tilling in 93, I took it out of alfalfa with the herbicide, converted it to no-till. So that's been no-till since 1983, 30 years. The lime-barred field is right next to it. It's been no-tilled since 1993. So there's 10 years difference. Both of these fields, side by side, have been under the same cropping regime. So they've had very diverse cash crops, diverse cover crops. The only difference is the lime-barred field has been mob grazed with livestock twice during the growing season. Now, look at on the far left, that's nitrogen, okay? There's not much difference, 86 to 90 pounds, no significant difference. Neither of these fields has had any synthetic fertilizer since 2008. Neither one has had manure applied to it, except for what drops out of the livestock. The next bar is phosphorus, inorganic phosphorus. In other words, it's available to the plant. We went from 65 pounds to 239 pounds, just from livestock grazing for 2 years in that sequence, high stock density. The next bar is potassium. We went from 429 to 595. What this shows us, and this is Dr. Haney's data, he did this test, is that the act of livestock grazing adds another component. And it signals those plants to release root exudates, and then we're breaking down more of that organic forms of phosphorus and potassium, making it available to the plants. So, for straight crop guys only, if you think, well, I don't need livestock, okay, maybe you don't, but you're missing part of the piece of the puzzle. What many producers back home are starting to do is the straight cash grain guys, they don't want to monkey with livestock. That's fine. They're going finding the livestock guys and say, hey, here, let's work together. The cash grain guy is supplying the land, equipment. The livestock guy supplies the cover crop seed, the cattle, brings them on there, grazes, but he has to do it in a proper fashion, leaving residue. They're working together. It's a win-win situation for both of them. It can work. It's just a matter of thinking outside the box. But then you think back of how a natural native ecosystem functions and how our soils were formed. This kind of proves it. Now, there's going to be a lot more research like this being done. There's several operations across the U.S. that our researchers are working with to document this. I am not a scientist, but one thing, when you get out in front of the public as much as I do, I get every scientist coming to me wanting to do research on our operation. I don't turn them away. You know, the only thing is they got to do, I'm not going to do a bunch of replicated trials and throw a monkey wrench into my management. They're going to have to look at what I'm doing and figure it out accordingly. The majority of them throw up their hands and say, Gabe, we can't do research. You got way too many variables. I said, well, deal with it, because I'm not changing my management just to fit your research. But this is what it's all about. It's about the life in the soil. That photo there was taken late in the year, and look, we still got earthworms up working. We got nutrient cycling occurring. Again, which would you rather have, natural or synthetic? And I'm not bashing synthetic fertilizers. I'm certainly not bashing biologicals or anything. I'm just saying, understand the whole system. We already know in the textbooks, Brady and Weil's textbook on soils, that's been in our colleges for 40 years, you know that less than 40% of the fertilizer you applied makes it to the plant anyway. Well now, if you're also not able to utilize what's available biologically, boy, you're missing out on a big chunk of potential profit. That's just a close-up of us no-tilling through that type of residue. It can be done. So many people want to see those soils black. We don't even use the trash whippers, obviously. That's way too much tillage. There's the corn and vetch and clover. Here's a field of corn that we went in at about V5 and we broadcast different brassicas in. I don't do that very often. It doesn't work well. We just get too dry most years to get those to germinate. But the beauty of that is you have it available for the livestock then during the winter. You know, it didn't make sense to me for years how I'd process all my forage, haul it into the feed yard. Every day during the winter I'd load it in a feeder wagon, feed it, and then I spend 2 weeks in the summer hauling the manure out. Why don't I let those cattle walk? They have legs. You know, it doesn't make sense. Other ways you can fit covers into the system. This is a cool season mix. This is an oat pea vetch mix. Works really well. In our colder environment, as you'd have here, we can get in really early in the year and seed oats and peas and get that into the system. This is oats, peas, kale, vetch, and there was a little Sudan grass thrown into that mix there. Plant diversity is the key for enhancing soil life in the long term. Here's a close-up of that cover crop. You know, look at the different leaf sizes and shapes, all the different heights of canopy. You got legumes, you got grasses, you got brassicas. You're feeding soil life. Then what we'll do, we can take that off for forage, but we prefer to let the livestock take it out, again with high stock densities, using these bat latches. We can get pretty good gains on these livestock. One of the things I really believe is happening, there's some research papers out there that prove it, that the act of an animal grazing, all of us who have watched a cow graze know she ropes the grass, tugs on it, and it tears it off. And that act of that happening, that plant then sends a signal to its roots, hey, we were damaged, we got to send out more carbon, or root exudates, to attract biology so we can regrow. What's happening during that whole process is those root exudates then are helping break down those organic forms, convert them to inorganic via the biology. Now, I had one producer at a meeting say, okay, if he doesn't have livestock, can he just cut it with a dull sickle? I don't know. That'd have to be another whole research paper on that one. But if you properly manage your grazing of your livestock, then you can get this type of armor, this type of protection, and that's what we want. Where in nature do you see bare soil? She's going to try and put something on there all the time. You know? Why do we get weeds? Nature's trying to cover the soil. Continue regeneration then. See, oats, peas, now we go to something else. Triticale vetch, go to something else. You continue it. Sometimes we'll harvest a crop for combining, like that winter triticale or rye, or up in our area we grow a lot of peas for grain. There's still a window of time. Rather than let it sit bare, let's go in there with species like buckwheat and vetches. Here's cowpea, proso millet, buckwheat. I tell producers, even if you got 50 days, rather than not grow anything, these species here, in 50 days, I can have a lot of biomass. And I can fix a lot of nutrients. I can build organic matter. I can start that nutrient cycling process. This is one of the first ones. I mentioned it this morning. Cowpeas and Sudan grass. That's a no-brainer. I have a hard time sometimes convincing people that they shouldn't, they've been used to growing only Sudan grass. At least put a legume with it. Work on it. On your left, that tall young guy, I claim him as my son. My wife says it was a tall mailman, but I don't know. He's 6'4½", so I don't know where he got his height. His mother's shorter than me. But anyway, I challenged my son years ago. I knew he was going to come back to the place, and I said, Paul, this place will be yours, but you have to grow the operation. And I don't mean grow it horizontally with more acres. We're actually shrinking the size of our operation. I said, you've got to grow in your thought process and your ideas. And you got to expand on what I'm doing. And so we set up a transition plan before he even got out of high school. So in 20 years' time on the place, the whole place will be his, and I'll be sitting in a cabin somewhere fishing. Maybe northern Michigan, I don't know. I got to get up here during the summer and see what it's like. But anyway, you got to start thinking of things like this, and you got to start challenging the next generation, whether it be a family member or somebody else. So my son, being the smart aleck he is, he was in college, he wasn't even home, and he calls me up one day and he says, Dad, you've lectured about diversity of plants. We need all these different diverse species, but for livestock, we don't have a lot of diversity, he says. Oh, I got ahead of myself. He says, we need sheep on the operation. Well, what could I do? I've stuck my foot in my mouth there, so I had to allow him to get sheep. And I tell everybody, these sheep are on a planned grazing system. Wherever they plan on going, that's where they go. and they do. It's kind of funny. That home section of mine, those sheep were on there last summer, and they never once went into the wife's garden. They never went into the flower bed. They never went into a cash grain field unless the cattle had grazed like a cover crop. Then they'd go in there. And I think part of it was at lambing time, we had a few of them get picked off from coyotes, and I think it was just natural predator-prey relationship. And so he added sheep to the operation. And the one thing Paul's really doing is he's taken direct marketing to the next level. I mean, eggs, grass-fed beef, lambs. He started pastured laying hens a number of years ago. That was one of the first pictures. We don't use the netting anymore. That's a little automatic gate opener on the side of that. He's taken these old stock trailers, and I might have a picture. Nope. He tears out the floor in them and puts a graded floor, has nest boxes and roosts in there and water in there, and we just pull these around behind the cattle. There you see the yearlings behind there. And it's really added a lot of income for him. I could never figure out why a 25-year-old kid at that time wanted laying hens. That just didn't make sense to me. But what he does, once a week, he takes all his eggs, goes to this park in town, and then 150 young ladies surround him and start buying eggs for $4 a dozen. Now it makes sense to me. Now, yeah, that makes more sense. But then he added pastured poultry. This was the first little broiler mobile he made. He now has several of them. One of the things Paul thought about, Dad, we're selling that grain off the place, and we don't use any GMOs, and we're selling all non-GMO grains. But if we ever have a weed issue or we have a few more weed seeds in our grain than we like, we run it through a quick cleaner. Because why haul that to the elevator? Paul takes that screenings that we would just be docked for at the elevator. He gets $5 a pound for this poultry. He's sold out before we even butchered them. He's only limited by the number his mom and dad will help him butcher. That's the only limiting factor. Can't produce enough of them. That is the most profitable single enterprise on our ranch, hands down. When you can convert them in a matter of 8-10 weeks, and he's getting $20+ a piece. How much do you think he gets for a turkey? $75. $75 sold out before he even harvests them. Now, I thought that was a lot of money until in Missouri there was a guy at the conference there who said he has a friend in New York who's selling them for $225. Heritage birds at Thanksgiving. Unreal. He's also started in the hog business and has pastured hogs also. You know, all I'm trying to get across to you here is there's a lot of different income streams that you can have. Now, in North Dakota, there was only 2 meat processors that were state inspected. Waiting list is 13 months. So a group of us got together and we built our own processing facility now. It's state inspected, but we're adding value to our product, and it's working out well. We have our own label. That's our ranch's own label, Nourished by Nature, and he's marketing direct to consumers. You know, and it's not for everybody, but if you want to add value, want to ensure yourself a market, why not? Look at all the different income streams I showed you today off that operation. We're shrinking the size of our operation. We don't have hired men. It's Paul and I and my wife. That's it. And so we're limited that way. We no longer, I don't worry about the price of commodities anymore. I could care less what the price of corn or beans are. I'm a least cost producer. I'm going to produce it cheaper than almost anybody else. And I've got so many different income streams now, just doesn't matter to us. We're becoming self-sufficient. You're only limited by your imagination. Because if you have healthy soil, you're going to have clean air, clean water, healthy plants, healthy animals, healthy people. That's what it's all about. I got to take a breath. Questions? Yes?
When you showed the chart on your cattle versus cropping, was that taking into account your 10%, or was that every year, or how would that?
Yeah. The question is as far as the income of those. As I said, where we're able to grow the cover crops and harvest them with livestock, we charge that amount to the livestock, the cover crops that are growing, to the livestock. On those 400 acres where we do not grow, where we're not able to graze livestock, that then is charged to the cropland.
But was the cattle side of it harvested by cattle every year, or 10%, or once every 10 years?
No, but of those, no, you got to realize those 1,600 acres that I'm able to graze cattle on have cattle on them every year, usually just cow-calf pairs, okay? So that cover crop charge on those acres gets charged to the cow-calf operation.
You made the comment before, 10% of our cropland is grazing, only 10% of our cropland is grazing.
Only 10% of our cropland is season-long grazing, where I'm growing the fall biennial and the warm season. See, full year cover crop. Okay.
Available enough, you are grazing cropland every year, huh?
Oh, I'm grazing 10% of my cropland is getting grazed season long.
But I'm talking at any time.
At any time? At any time, there's going to be some cropland with livestock grazing on it. Yes. Okay. Yes.
So you're winter triticale and hairy vetch, and then you're harvesting that triticale and vetch through the livestock primarily. So on the vetch, I've heard time and time again that can then also become a noxious weed. So
yes.
How do you prevent that?
Yes, the vetch with being a noxious weed. I've been growing it since 1994. It has not proliferated on my operation, but realize I'm in a drier rainfall environment. So just because it's not a problem on my operation doesn't mean it can't become one on yours. I am assuming that in a wetter type environment, it would be a little more of a problem. However, I really think there's a huge variation as to the varieties of hairy vetch. Some have less than 5% hard seed, some have 30-40% hard seed. We're producing our own vetch on our own operation. So I know it's northern, it's acclimated, and I'm not having a problem with hard seed. Another question is on the toxicity of hairy vetch.
Well, and also talk on prussic acid on your sorghum.
Also talk on prussic acid on the sorghum. I have grazed pure stands of hairy vetch and never ever lost an animal. I researched this once early on because I heard that it could be a problem. I found one paper in Brazil where a couple sheep died. Well, sheep sometimes just want to die, you know. So be it. I have never had cattle die on hairy vetch. Now, I suppose it could happen, but I've never seen it. Prussic acid on the sorghum Sudan grass. Another reason to have polyculture diverse cover crops. The cattle aren't just going to select one single thing. On our operation, and I honestly mean this, I have never lost an animal to bloat grazing, never, and I've never lost an animal to prussic acid. But that's my operation. If you have a problem on it on your operation, then you better be concerned about it. We just don't.
So you're not afraid of grazing the livestock on the pasture that has whatever you got in there, crops with...
You know, I learned one thing a long time ago about livestock. They'll only die once. You know what? If they don't become acclimated, they're not meant to be on our operation. But that comes down, and I mean that somewhat sarcastically, but really, guys, if you don't have cattle that can acclimate to your operation, get different cattle or different sheep or different whatever. Because the way to make money in this business is having what's adapted best to your operation. Just because it works on Gabe's, it may not work on yours. That's why I won't select your cover crop, because it may be or may not be right for you. Yes?
You buy your seed?
Do I buy my seed? We combine a lot of our, small grains, peas, hairy vetch, those type of things, because I don't want to write a check. The specialties like the radishes, turnips, kale, those brassicas, we buy them. We do buy them, and they're readily available. Just make sure you find a good source of seed who knows about resource concerns, carbon-nitrogen ratios, nutrient cycling, et cetera, et cetera. Yes?
I was at a conference a week or two ago, and he said, never plant buckwheat. Once you planted it, and I've never heard that before.
Never plant buckwheat, that'll proliferate. One of the major benefits we have from being in a northern climate is we have winter. If you're going to plant buckwheat, just plant it, so most years it'll freeze off before it goes to seed. That's what we try and use. Use your environment to your advantage. Buckwheat will go to seed rapidly, yes. Question here.
No, it's just a comment. I've got small acreage grass-fed beef cattle operation, and most of the paddocks have more than 40% legume content in them. And the two major things that fall in this category that we're talking about that happen on my place is that my Canadian thistle population has dropped way down, and so I don't worry about that anymore and let the goldfishes help. And the other thing is that I have never had any bloat problems or anything like that.
Your cattle are acclimated to your area. And I mentioned we had the CRP that was 10% Canada thistle. Our cattle eat Canada thistle. We actually have cattle that are eating leafy spurge, if you know what that is. Now, we don't have much leafy spurge, but our cattle, there isn't much they won't eat. Absinthe, wormwood, any of the noxious weeds. Livestock are a tool to be used. Yes?
Are your cattle ever grazing on the native rangeland?
Yeah, those 2,000 acres, you bet. That's the majority of where the cow-calf pairs are. The majority of summer are on native range. We also stockpile a lot of grass. They're grazing that late fall into early winter. They're on native range a lot. We got 2,000 acres. Now, I didn't mention how many livestock we run. We have 350 cow-calf pairs. That's a constant. We run between 300 and 800 yearlings, stocker cattle, plus we have the grass-finished end of it too, which numbers will vary, and then the small herds of sheep, etc. So we got a few livestock. We got to have some acres for them.
So then one of your primary benefits to your cover crops, I think you said, was you're filling in that gap.
We're filling in the nutritional gap with the cover crops. The other thing, cover crops, if you're in a grass-finished operation, nothing to put on gain as well as the C4 grasses. Your warm season, sorghum sudan, grazing corn, etc. Is my time up, Kim, or where are we at? Okay, another question.
Question for your son, Paul. Are those laying hens out there 12 months or shorter?
Yeah, no, shorter than that. There's no way in the winter they'd make it. He's got a chicken coop with an enclosed kennel type, because the coyote population during the winter and the owls, we get great horned owls moving in, it just decimate them. So during the winter, but we let them shut down. They don't lay during the winter, because they'll lay according to day length, according to sunlight. So we let them shut down. They need a little rest too. Yes?
What's your typical grass mixture that you go to? In other words, if you were going to seed in a pasture,
If I'm going to seed grass in a pasture, one of the things we're starting to do, and there just wasn't enough time to get into it today, we're starting to seed some of our cropland back to native perennial species. Big blue stem, little blue, Indian grass, switchgrass, etc. You know, echinacea, all these different forbs. We're starting to seed some of it back because remember my slide this morning, it's all about carbon. Nothing's going to store carbon long term than perennial species. So we prefer to seed back to natives. Yep. Yes?
If you didn't have the native grassland, would you make more pasturing your cropland year-round than you're doing on crop?
Would I make more money grazing cropland than natives? We would dollar more per acre, and I'm thoroughly convinced I can take about anybody's cash crop and I can net more dollars running it through livestock than they can combining it and selling it, especially now with $4 corn. You know, I could do that. There was a young man in Missouri the last 2 days who is doing that. He's more or less running a feedlot operation on crop ground, grazing corn and cover crops. It's pretty amazing what he's doing. Yes?
If you were a dairy producer and producing milk requires a lot of energy, how would you do things differently?
Well, that's where the dairy producer with more energy, what crops, then you have to get into those C4s. Energy crops like brown midrib, sorghum, Sudan, grazing corn, those types. That will have more energy because it's a C4 grass. One of the things I wasn't able to show you here, I didn't have a slide on it, but bricks, a refractometer. We're taking bricks readings on all these. We're seeing where the energy is. And you need to be doing that, following that. Is extremely important. Anything else? Okay, thank you. Oh, okay.
You've given the advice to crop farmers how beneficial the livestock would be. I'm on the other side. I hate driving tractors. How important is putting cash crops into my livestock operation?
How important is cash crops into your livestock operation? I hate sitting on tractors, combines too. About as bad as I hate sitting on airplanes. But anyway, I would not go break up land and if I was a livestock guy and had a system, as long as that system had the forage chain that you want and you had the nutrients available, I would not break up that land and put it in crop ground. I just wouldn't. But that's each person's individual goal. I'm not going to try and convince somebody to do something they don't want to do.